The Denver Police Department began rolling out a new use of force policy this week with the end goal of setting new guidelines for what is considered reasonable force. DPD hopes that this new policy will address controversial issues regarding the use of lethal force. Justine, this seems like it always is a big issue in the Denver Police Department, but this has been a long time coming. From what we know about it so far, what are your thoughts?
Well, growing up in Denver, I've watched the police go through many scandals and watched many people be taxpayers pay out many payments to victims of police brutality in the city. I mean, I've read through a lot of this, and it seems great, and I like this. I think that there needs to be more emphasis on implicit bias and more emphasis on how we hire our police officers, how we're screening them, who's temperamental enough to show up and, actually resolve issues instead of escalating issues, which we often see and which I've often experienced growing up in this city. So I'd like to see more emphasis around that and see more emphasis on diversity within the police force here in Denver. And I think those will actually help solve a lot of these issues more.
Ross, what do you think? The Denver Police Department is often in the news for use of force stuff, and I don't know how much is related to here is the policy on paper versus particular actions in this event by a particular person. Does a use of force policy really help address it?
Well, I hope that it does, and I think a big part of policing, especially in a major city, is whether your population trusts the police, believes in the police, and I think this is a big step in the right direction. And I'm not enough of an expert on police issues to say this is the right policy, this is the wrong policy, but I like the direction they're going, and very much has to do with public confidence. And I guess I'd add, slightly sarcastically, if you want to make sure that the police never use too much force, give them plastic guns.
Patty, this seems like the new chief's first big test, although this process started way before he was sworn in.
In fact, you can trace this process back to 2005 and the shooting of Paul Childs, who was mentally impaired 15-year-old up in this neighborhood. Cops were called. There's some debate over how much they knew about his condition, but he wound up shot dead. And so there have been a lot of things on training, on when force is important. And this predates, goes back to Al LeCabe as manager of safety. It goes through a couple police chiefs. It's been delayed. Robert White was supposed to have released it. So now Chief Payson has put it out, which is good. It's a good start. Let's make sure there's a lot of community discussion of it, and that when there are allegations of excessive force, that there's a transparent discussion.
David, you've studied these kinds of use of force policies throughout the country, so you're a great person to go to with this. From what we've seen so far, what do you think of the new rollout?
It's a good idea, and it reflects appropriate negotiations in which the police officers themselves and their union were part of the discussion, as they absolutely should be. For example, there was one version said use of force has to be reasonable, necessary, and appropriate. And the union said, well, reasonable and necessary, that's got some guidance, but what does appropriate mean? How could something be reasonable and necessary and yet be inappropriate? So that was taken out. And another thing, something that's being added, is use of force is often on, what level of from a taser, all up through firearms. This also talks about the amount of force. So you may be using an appropriate amount of force to resolve the situation, but maybe after it's resolved, you ought to stop clubbing the guy over the head, for example. So it's all good. If you want more police brutality and more police corruption, certainly the way to go is to follow the Los Angeles Police Department, which implemented a hard quota system and hired on race rather than merit. All the studies consistently show that mediocrity in policing is one of the biggest risk factors for all kinds of police misbehavior. So we ought to have the best police officers regardless of their race.